hands up if you like stories about monsters. Oh, you do? Okay. Hands up if you love stories about monsters. Oh, excellent. Hands up if you like your monsters big and scary. Excellent. Hands up if you like monsters who eat children. Now, hands down, put your hands back down. If you leave your hands in the air, somebody might come along and bite them off. So hands down for a minute. So I'm going to ask today, why? Why do we like that? Why do we like stories about big, nasty, scary things that want to eat us? Why do we enjoy those stories? Now, I've been telling stories about mythical monsters and writing books about magical monsters for about 10 years now. So I hope I have some sense of why we love monster stories, or at least some sense of why I love them. So I'm going to discuss a few potential reasons why people might like monster stories. And I'm going to name drop as many monsters as I can while I'm doing it. I should also say, we've got this lovely screen. So I wanted to put some pictures up there so you don't just have to look at me waving my arms about. And the easiest pictures for me, the most relevant probably as well for me, were pictures from my books. So that's what I'm going to be putting up here if I remember to click. And they're all by fabulous artists. I don't draw any of the pictures. So if you want to know any more about the artists, or about the books, or about the monsters, come up and chat to me at the end. So, monster stories. I love monster stories. I tell them all the time. I have a couple of monster stories that I tell that are suitable for quite little people. Told one of them today. I have hordes of monster stories that I tell that are suitable for upper primary age kids. And I've got a very small number of stories that are so horrifying that I only tell them to teenagers. But I don't just retell monster stories. I also write books with monsters in them. I borrow monster magic. I borrow monster imagery for my novels. But in all the books I've ever written, I've only ever had to invent a couple of monsters. Even though inventing monsters is fab fun, you don't actually need to, because old myths and old legends contain so many wonderful monsters. It's hardly ever necessary to make your own up completely. And I know, at least I think I know, why I love telling monster stories. But this event isn't about me. This speech isn't about me. Because I'm one of those strange writery people who has to spend their life inside stories. So it's actually my job to love monsters. What I want to think about is why almost everyone, almost everywhere, in almost every culture, at almost every point in human history, has loved listening to and telling monster stories. And that includes you, because so many of you put your hands up when I asked if you love monster stories. But I believe that we have been telling monster stories for a very long time. The oldest monster stories that I tell are actually Sumerian myths. They're from about the Sumerian gods and the Sumerian monsters they battled. Those were ancient myths written in cuneiform, which is the oldest form of writing. They were written on tablets. They were hidden under the sands of Iraq and only found and translated just over 100 years ago. And those are ancient monster stories. But the weird thing about those monster stories is they don't actually describe the monsters terribly well. I tell a story about a goddess called Inanna who escaped from a couple of really terrifying monsters. At least I assume they were terrifying because she was escaping from them. One was an enkum and one was a kugulal. And the ancient stories that tell of this escape don't actually describe the enkum and the kugula. They go into huge detail about all the gifts people were given at a feast, but they don't describe the monsters at all. And that has always puzzled me, because it made me think, well, did people not find monsters exciting 5,000 years ago? Well, actually, I don't think it suggests that, because I think audiences were already familiar with those monsters. If I said to you, oh, there's a girl over there being chased by a dragon, you would get a picture of a dragon into your head, wouldn't you? You would immediately, with that one word, would you see something in your head when I said dragon? Would it be big, with claws and maybe wings and some fire? a general lizard shape. That one word dragon would put a picture in your head because you've already heard lots of stories about dragons. So I assume that the words Kugulal and Enkum put pictures into the heads of Sumerian children, vivid, exciting, monstrous pictures, because they had already heard stories about those monsters. So I think that shows that we can be sure monster stories have been being told for a very long time. But I believe that a lot of the stories we tell about monsters are even older than the myths written down in cuneiform thousands of years ago. One of the things I love most about researching and retelling traditional tales is identifying the similarities between lots of stories. There are famous fairy tale type stories, for example, like Cinderella. Anybody here a Cinderella fan? No, we have my favourite kind of audience here. I don't honestly tell Cinderella stories much. I'm more into defeating dragon type stories than getting married at the end type stories. I can't get excited about them. But there are Cinderella type stories from all over the world. Not necessarily a shoe fitting a foot, but maybe a bracelet fitting a wrist or a ring fitting a finger, as a way of identifying a future wife. And those stories are told all over the world, and we have very ancient forms of those stories. And I think monster stories are just as widespread. Dragon stories, for example. There's a dragon. There are dragon stories in many cultures all over the world. This one here is a Viking dragon. He's called Fafnir, and he was illustrated by the lovely Kate James for a collection of Norse saga tales we did together. So we know that the Vikings told stories. There are also Scottish dragons. Did you know Dundee has a dragon story? Dundee has its own dragon. But there are dragons all over the British Isles, all over Europe, all the way through to Asia. Lots of cultures have dragons. In fact, dragons are such a common story monster that often the most interesting thing about a dragon story is how it was defeated. This one here, he was defeated by being ambushed from underneath, stabbed in his soft belly from a pit dug in his garden path. But I tell dragon stories where the dragon is defeated using barrels of rice. Anybody hear me tell that one earlier today? Yes. Or armour of ice, or a booby-trapped sheep. That's a particularly fun one. In fact, I feel that how the monster is defeated is often the most exciting bit of a monster story. It's certainly why I'm drawn to monster stories. And just like some monsters are widespread across cultures, so are many of the ways of defeating monsters. Being swallowed by a monster in order to defeat it from the inside. We were talking about that earlier today, weren't we? There are lots and lots of stories that use that as a tactic, actually going inside the belly of the beast in order to defeat it. There's a Scottish story about a farm boy called Assapatel who uses that to defeat a sea monster. There's a Native American Blackfoot warrior story about a boy going inside a giant fish. There's a Siberian swordswoman who defeats a giant serpent. All of them going willingly inside the belly of the beast and then either burning or cutting their way out, often to save other people. Now, that same method turns up in stories all over the world. Why? How have all these old stories evolved from one very ancient story? Well, perhaps because it could be said that being swallowed and escaping again is such an obvious way to defeat a monster so big it can swallow you whole, that tactic could have been imagined by different people telling different stories all in various places all over the world. But there are other tactics. There are more unlikely, less obvious ways to defeat monsters that crop up in lots of different places. There are, for example, monsters who hide their hearts outside their bodies. They can't be defeated unless their hidden heart is destroyed. And I know a story about a giant from Scotland and a story about Dev from Tajikistan, which has exactly the same monster death avoidance strategy and also exactly the same way of defeating that monster. And there's another anti-monster tactic that appears in lots of places too. There are stories about being chased by something that wants to eat you and escaping by throwing small objects over your shoulder which turn into something else when they hit the ground. Maybe a comb becomes a forest, or a pebble becomes a mountain range, or a branch becomes a fierce animal. And all of those things stop your pursuer while you get away. Now, I know, anybody know the story of Baba Yaga? That's a Russian story, and the girl who escapes does that. But I also know a Siberian version. Now, Russia and Siberia, that makes sense geographically. I know a story with exactly the same way of escaping from the Amazon rainforest. Now, culturally and geographically, they are so far apart. So I wonder how that same method of escaping a monster can turn up in stories told so far apart. Could they perhaps have developed from one very old tale, one story, spreading across the world, changing as it went, but always keeping some of the same essential elements? Because here's the thing, monsters are really heavy, but monster stories are really light. We carry them in our memories. We pass them to one person from mouth to ear as we walk or work or sit by a fire. So I wonder whether these similarities suggest that some monster stories have been travelling across the earth as long as people have. And that's one reason I love monster stories. They're a shared legacy from our remote ancestors, not as old as dinosaur bones, but as old as humanity. But why do you love monster stories? Hands up if you like being scared. Hands up if you like the shiver of fear when a monster appears in a story. A few of you. Hands up if you breathe a sigh of relief when the monster is defeated. A few of you. Hands up if you very occasionally want the monster to win. Excellent. Well, this here, that's a Kelpie, okay? It's a Scottish shape-shifting monster, a water horse. There are Kelpie stories from all over Scotland, well, all up from the Highlands up. Now, who knows what Kelpies like to eat? Humans, absolutely. Kelpies like to eat humans. They like to eat a particular kind of human. Anybody want to make a guess? Children. Kelpies like to eat children. Now, when I read this book in schools or at book festivals to audiences of 5- and 6-year-olds, I always ask that. I always make sure they know before we start reading what Kelpies snack on. I always make sure that my audience know that Kelpies want to eat you. Yes, they do. And that frisson of fear about a child-eating monster makes reading the story much more fun. Well, maybe just more fun for me. But I think we like being scared. I think we all like being scared, but I think we like being scared when we're cozied up by the fire or on the couch beside people we love, beside people we trust to keep us safe. And stories, especially stories about monsters we know aren't real, are the safest way to feel that fear. The variety of ways that we can see monsters being defeated in stories can give us hope. And it might even give us ideas of how to overcome our own obstacles. When I'm working with young writers using my adventure novels to discuss how to make stories exciting, we often talk about imagining obstacles for our characters to overcome. And I've noticed that the obstacles young writers most enjoy imagining, then overcoming, are the monster-shaped ones. And as well as being great fun, writing about defeating monsters is actually problem-solving. Thinking through the problem, examining different options to deal with it, testing them out, and then choosing the best way to defeat the beast in front of you. Perhaps even learning from that how to defeat the next monster along. You and I, we might never wield swords of ice, or take advice from talking animals, or puzzle out the right answer to a Sphinx's riddle in order to defeat the obstacles we all face in life. But perhaps we are learning how to overcome our own personal obstacles when we're enjoying monster stories. Now, I love monsters. I love ingenious ways to defeat monsters, but I'm most passionate about who defeats monsters. When I'm writing monster stories myself, it's usually a child who defeats the monster. When I'm retelling traditional tales, I find myself most drawn to girls who defeat their own monsters, rather than waiting for blokes with swords to swoop in and save them. I do love, and I do tell man versus beast stories, but there are so many of them. And they're so well known, Theseus and the Minotaur, George and the Dragon. I like to redress the balance with a few heroines. And I don't make my heroines up. Well, I do when I'm writing novels. But when I'm retelling myths, I don't make the heroines up. I don't take a monster-defeating story starring a boy and pull the boy out and shove a girl in. What I do is I go searching for authentic monster-defeating heroines, all the way back to Inanna. I'd love to find some further back than Inanna, but I don't know how I will without them written down. And I tell their stories, like the story about Chi that I told this morning, or the story about Durga, who defeats a demon, or Tokoyo, who skinned a sea serpent. I seem to be taken against sea monsters. Sorry about that. I also think that there may be more stories, more girls defeating monster stories that we've lost, or stories that have maybe even been changed. For example, Little Red Riding Hood. The Little Red Riding Hood we all know, she's usually saved by a woodcutter or a huntsman or some other bloke with a blade. But I know earlier versions of Little Red Riding Hood where she escaped the wolf herself, using a trick, a slightly rude trick about pretending to go to the toilet. So I think maybe there are older stories with girls defeating monsters that we've lost. Now, Little Red Riding Hood's wolf was obviously a monster if you could see past the nightcap and the nightie. But not all monsters look like monsters. And not all monsters act like monsters. I sometimes tell stories about fearsome-looking creatures who are actually hurt or killed by human beings. They don't mean any harm to anyone, but people are cruel to them. There's actually quite a lot of Scottish saints being horrible to giants stories that I'm working on at the moment. So not all monsters are monstrous. And quite a few monsters look human, at least some of the time. They're maybe only part-time monsters. I love stories about shapeshifters, people who turn into wolves, people who turn into snakes, people who turn into dragons. And sometimes the most fearsome-looking monsters aren't really monstrous at all. Hands up if you love Nessie. Very few people. Hands up if you believe in Nessie. Hands up if you've ever seen Nessie. Oh my goodness, we need to talk to all of you later. So, Nessie is a really unusual monster. From a storytelling point of view, Nessie is definitely one of the most unusual and therefore most fascinating monsters around. For a start, she's not actually monstrous. She's not dangerous or scary or cruel or man-eating or child-eating. The creature in Loch Ness, if she's there, hasn't actually done anything nasty to anyone since about 565 AD when St. Columba met a monster in the loch. Since then, after quite a long quiet spell, a sudden reappearance about 100 years ago, Nessie hasn't done anyone any harm at all. And also the main story about Nessie is her mystery. I know, because I've looked for them, that there aren't any story-length folk tales about people meeting Nessie or tales about what she wants or any specific lore about Nessie's powers or magic. There is just one question. Does she exist? And that's very unusual for a monster, particularly one who's so well known. We know her name. We know her location. We all have an image of what she looks like, sometimes with a tartan tammy. I'm delighted to say Natasha Elenchich's Nessie's far too classy for a tammy, but we don't know any of Nessie's stories, which is why we like to make them up, or I do anyway. So here we have a contradictory monster. She's ancient, but she's also very modern. She's mysterious, but she's also very well known. We've got lots of gossip about her, but no solid folklore stories. No wonder we're all fascinated by Nessie. So I hope that has given you a few glimpses into why we might love monster stories. We like to be scared. We need to see monsters defeated. We can learn from the different ways they are defeated. And human beings have been telling monster stories for a very long time. Monsters quite often like to eat human beings. But perhaps sharing monster stories is part of what makes us human.